In the winter of 1887, in a narrow room above a money house in the City of London, a man sat with a knife in his hand and a body on the table in front of him. The body was not flesh. It was something stranger. It was an entire economy, laid open under the lamplight, and the man bending over it had been hired to do what no one else would dare. He had been hired to cut into a living giant, to find out how it actually worked. And when he found out, he was told, very quietly and very firmly, that what he had seen must never be published. This is the story of that man, of what he cut open, and of the report that was locked in a drawer for the rest of his life. Because the giant he opened was not dead. It was breathing. It was the financial system of the largest empire the world had ever seen, and what he discovered inside it was not a heart of gold. It was something that the men who paid him needed the public never to understand. His name, as far as the surviving papers tell us, was given as a surgeon, though he was not a surgeon of the body. I have to pause here for a second. Because what I just described, that is one case from a much larger pattern. There are 35 documented cases in a document I put together. Different cities, different decades, different types of evidence. Every single one follows the same sequence: discovered, documented, acquired, disappeared. I could not fit all of it into a video. It's in the pinned comment below. Find it before we continue. He was a surgeon of accounts. In the language of the time, he would have been called an examiner, or an inspector, or simply a clever man who could read a ledger the way a doctor reads a wound. He had been trained in the counting houses of the north, in the cotton towns where fortunes were made and unmade in a single bad season, and he had earned a reputation for one rare and dangerous talent. He could look at a set of books that had been arranged to deceive, and he could see through the arrangement to the truth underneath. He could find the body inside the bandages. That talent was why they came for him. They were directors of a great institution, the kind of institution whose name appeared on banknotes and whose word could move governments. They had a problem they could not solve with their own men because their own men were part of the problem. Something was wrong inside the machine. Money was moving in ways that did not match the official story. The giant was alive and prosperous on the surface, but somewhere beneath the surface there was a flow that no one could account for, and the directors, who were not honest men but were frightened men, wanted to know where it went before it destroyed them. So they offered him a sum of money that he could not refuse. It was not a fee. It was the kind of figure that ends a man's need to work again, the kind of figure that is offered precisely because it is also a kind of leash, binding the one who takes it to the silence of the one who gives it. He understood this dimly even as he accepted, and he accepted anyway, because there are forms of curiosity that are stronger than caution, and his was one of them. They gave him a room at the top of the building, far from the public floors, a plain room with a single high window and a lamp and a long table. And they gave him the books, all of them, not the polished ledgers that were shown to shareholders, but the working accounts, the private memoranda, the correspondence that was never meant to leave the building. They told him to take as long as he needed. They told him to write down everything he found. And then, in a sentence he would remember for the rest of his life, they told him that the report he produced would belong to them, and to them alone, forever. He should have understood in that moment what he was being hired to do, but the work was too interesting and the money was too good, and so he sat down and he began to cut. The first thing he found in the first week was that the giant did not make its money the way everyone believed it did. The public story, the story told in newspapers and in Parliament and in polite dinner conversation, was that this institution grew rich by lending to honest enterprise. It lent to the mill owner who needed to buy cotton, to the shipper who needed to fit out a voyage, to the merchant who needed to bridge the gap between buying his goods and selling them. In that story, the institution was a kind of servant to the real economy. It oiled the wheels. It took a modest fee for a useful service, and everyone prospered together. It was a comfortable story, and it had the great advantage of being partly true, but only partly. When the surgeon traced the actual flows of money, week by week and account by account, he found that the lending to honest enterprise was the smaller half of the business. The larger half, the half that produced the real profit, was something else entirely. The institution made most of its money not by lending to people who made things, but by standing between people who made things and the money they were owed. It had inserted itself into the gap between work and reward, and it charged a toll on that gap, and the toll was the true source of its wealth. He sat with this discovery for several days before he understood how large it was. Every cargo that crossed the sea, every bale of cotton that moved from the field to the mill, every shipment of grain, every consignment of iron passed through a chain of paper. Bills of exchange, letters of credit, acceptances, discounts, and at nearly every link in that chain the giant took a small piece. No single piece was large enough to provoke outrage. That was the genius of it. The mill owner paid a little, the shipper paid a little, the merchant paid a little. The farmer at the far end of the chain, who never saw the inside of a money house in his life, paid the most of all, because the cost of every toll above him was passed down the chain until it reached the man who could not pass it on to anyone. The man at the bottom carried the whole weight, and he never knew the weight was there. This was the first thing the surgeon was told never to publish. Not because it was secret in the narrow sense. A clever economist could have worked it out, but because seeing it laid out plainly in figures in the institution's own hand would have changed the way ordinary people understood the wealth above them. It would have answered a question that the wealthy preferred to leave unasked. The question was simple. If the men at the top did not grow the cotton, did not spin it, did not weave it, did not ship it, did not sell it, then how exactly did they come to own so much more than the men who did all of those things? The surgeon now had the answer, written down, in black ink. They owned the gap. They owned the distance between effort and payment, and they had made that distance as wide and as profitable as they possibly could. He kept cutting. The second thing he found was worse, and it took him longer to find because it was hidden inside the structure of the lending itself. When the institution lent money, it did not, as most people imagined, lend out coins that savers had deposited. The surgeon had assumed this himself when he began. He had pictured a great vault of gold, and the institution carefully lending out a portion of it while keeping enough back to satisfy any depositor who came to withdraw. That was the picture in every school book. That was the picture the institution itself encouraged, because the picture of the careful vault made the institution seem prudent, restrained, almost humble in its caution. The reality, written in the working accounts, was nothing like the picture. For every coin of real gold in the vault, the institution had created and lent out many times that amount in credit. It did not move existing money from one hand to another. It wrote new money into existence with a stroke of the pen, lent that new money at interest, and collected the interest as if the money had always been real. The deposits of gold were not the source of the lending. They were the thin cushion that allowed the lending to appear safe. The true product of the institution was not gold at all. It was trust. It manufactured trust, sold trust at interest, and lived in permanent quiet terror that the trust might one day be called in all at once. The surgeon understood, sitting in that cold room, that he had found the beating heart of the giant, and that the heart was made of a promise that could not be kept. If every holder of the institution's paper had arrived on the same morning and demanded gold, there would not have been gold for 1 in 10 of them. The whole magnificent structure, the marble halls, the empire of credit, the fortunes of the directors, rested on the simple fact that everyone never asked for their money back on the same day. The giant was not strong, it was confident, and confidence, the surgeon now saw, was a thing that could vanish in an afternoon. He wrote this down too, carefully, because it was his job, and as he wrote it he began to feel the first cold touch of fear, because he understood that this was knowledge that the directors could never allow to spread. Not the detail of one institution, but the principle behind all of them. If ordinary people, the depositors, the small merchants, the working families who kept a few coins in the savings bank, ever truly understood that the money they trusted was mostly a promise stretched thin over a sliver of metal, then the trust itself would weaken. And if the trust weakened, the giant would not merely lose profit, it would die. The surgeon was not examining a patient. He was examining a creature that lived entirely on the belief of the people it fed upon, and his report, if published, was a weapon that could kill it. He thought, in those days, about stopping. He thought about returning the money and walking away. But he did not, and the reason he did not is the most human part of this whole story. He had become fascinated, not by the wealth, but by the structure. He had spent his life reading the books of failing mills and dishonest traders, small frauds, small tragedies. Now he was reading the books of the largest engine of money in the world, and he could not put them down. He wanted to understand the whole of it before he stopped. He wanted to follow the flow all the way to its end. And so he kept cutting, deeper than the directors had ever intended him to go. The third thing he found was the one they truly feared. It was not about lending, and it was not about gold. It was about who actually owned the giant and where the profit actually went, and the answer was not the answer that anyone outside the building believed. On paper, the institution was owned by its shareholders, a broad and respectable list of names. Country gentlemen, widows of means, charitable trusts, the comfortable middle ranks of a prosperous nation. The list was published. It looked like the ownership of the whole society, spread wide and fair. But when the surgeon traced the real voting power, the shares that actually decided what the institution did, he found that the broad list was a kind of curtain. Behind it stood a very small number of families and partnerships who, through a web of trusts and nominees and interlocking holdings, controlled the giant absolutely. The widows and the country gentlemen owned the risk. They held shares that could lose value, that paid a modest dividend, that gave them the comforting feeling of being part of the great enterprise. But they did not own the control. The control lived with perhaps a dozen interests, and those dozen interests had arranged things so that the profit flowed upward to them, while the risk flowed downward to everyone else. The surgeon followed the profit. He followed it out of the lending business and into the investments, and there he found the final chamber of the heart. The real money of the institution was not kept in the country that had produced it. It was sent abroad. It was lent to foreign governments at high interest, secured against the taxes those governments squeezed from their own poor. It was placed in railways and mines and plantations on the far side of the world, in places where labour cost almost nothing and could be made to cost less. The wealth that had been gathered from the gap between effort and payment at home was carried across the sea and used to open the same gap in a dozen other lands. The giant was not the servant of the nation, as the comfortable story claimed. The nation was one of its feeding grounds, and not even the largest. The surgeon had been hired to find a leak. What he had found was that the leak was the entire purpose of the machine. He finished his report in the early spring of that year. It ran to many pages, and it was written in the plain, careful, devastating language of a man who deals in proof and not in opinion. He did not accuse anyone of a crime, because in the strict legal sense there was no crime. Everything he described was permitted. That was the most damning thing of all. The structure was not a conspiracy against the law. It was the law, written by the very interests it served, arranged so that the gathering of wealth from those who made it would always be legal, always be respectable, always be invisible to those who paid for it. The surgeon's report did not reveal a band of thieves. It revealed a system, working exactly as it was designed to work. Before I go further, that document in the pinned comment. If you have not found it yet, go there now, because everything I cover in these videos is one piece of a pattern that only becomes visible when you see all 35 cases together. The document shows you the full pattern. What I can show you here is the surface. What is down there is everything underneath it. Pinned comment, now, then come back. In plain daylight, behind a curtain of comfortable stories. He delivered it to the directors on a grey morning, and he watched them read it. He had expected anger. He had expected perhaps an accusation that he had gone too far, that he had misread the accounts, that his conclusions were the fevered imaginings of a clerk who had been given too much rope. He received none of that. The directors read his report in silence, and when they had finished, the most senior of them set it down on the table and looked at the surgeon for a long moment, and what was in his face was not anger. It was recognition. The director was not surprised by a single word. He had known all of it already. They all had. The surgeon had not uncovered a secret that the directors were keeping from the world. He had uncovered the secret that the directors were keeping from themselves, the one they did not speak aloud even to one another, the one they preferred to leave in the dark of the working accounts, where it could do its work without being looked at directly. The director thanked him. He thanked him with great courtesy, and he paid him the remainder of his fee. And then he explained, in the gentle and final tone of a man closing a door, that the report would now become the property of the institution, and would not be published, would not be copied, would not be discussed, and that the surgeon would say nothing of its contents to anyone, ever, for the rest of his natural life. There was no threat in the words. There did not need to be. The surgeon understood that he was a man who had been allowed to see the inside of the giant, and that men who were allowed to see the inside did not afterward go walking through the streets describing it. He took his money, and he gave his silence, and he went home. And here is the strange and quiet thing that happened next. He kept the silence, not because he was afraid, though perhaps he was a little afraid. He kept it because, having seen the whole of the structure, he had understood something that made publication feel almost pointless. He had understood that the giant was protected not by secrecy, but by disbelief. He could have stood in the public square and read his reports aloud, every figure, every flow, every name behind the curtain, and most of the people who heard him would not have believed it. It was too large. It contradicted too many comfortable things. The story of the careful vault, the story of the honest servant of enterprise, the story of wealth as the just reward of effort, those stories were not merely lies told to the public. They were the floor the public stood on. To take them away was to ask people to stand on nothing. And most people, the surgeon had learned, would rather stand on a comfortable lie than on an uncomfortable truth, because the lie at least held their weight. So the report went into a drawer, and the surgeon went back to his ordinary work, reading the books of failing mills, and he grew older, and the giant he had opened grew larger, and the system he had described spread further across the world, exactly as his figures had predicted it would. He watched the decades pass. He watched the foreign loans and the foreign railways and the foreign mines multiply. He watched the gap between effort and payment widen at home, watched fortunes pile higher at the top, while the men at the bottom of the chain carried weights they could not see and could not name. He watched a financial panic come and pass, and the giant survive it by doing precisely what his report had said it would do, by manufacturing fresh confidence to replace the confidence that had failed. And through all of it he said nothing. He kept one copy of the report. He was not supposed to. He had been told that every copy belonged to the institution. But he was a careful man, and somewhere in the long nights of the examination he had made a second set of the most important pages, in his own hand, and he had hidden them. Not to publish. He had decided long ago that he would never publish. He kept them for a reason he found hard to explain, even to himself. He kept them so that the truth would exist somewhere, written down, even if no one ever read it. He kept them the way a man keeps the record of a thing he has seen and cannot prove, so that he will know in his own old age that he did not imagine it, that the giant was real, that he had cut it open, that what he found inside was exactly what he remembered finding. We know the story at all only because long after his death, those hidden pages were found among his private papers by a relative who did not understand what they were. They passed through several hands. They were nearly thrown away more than once. And the reason they survive is almost an accident, which is fitting, because the whole structure the surgeon described survives on a kind of accident too, the accident of people not looking too closely at the floor they stand on. There was a fourth thing the surgeon found, and of everything in his report it was the discovery that troubled his sleep the most, because it was the one that touched ordinary lives most directly and yet remained the most completely hidden from them. He had traced the lending. He had traced the trust stretched thin over the gold. He had traced the ownership behind the curtain and the wealth carried across the sea. Now, late in his examination, he turned to a set of accounts he had at first overlooked, accounts that recorded not the great loans to governments and railways, but the small, steady, endless business of the institution with the people of its own country. The savings of clerks, the deposits of shopkeepers, the little reserves of country parishes and burial clubs and friendly societies, the careful coins of people who had been taught that thrift was a virtue, and that to put money aside was the wisest thing a working man could do. The surgeon had always believed, as everyone believed, that these small savings were the foundation of the whole structure, that the great loans abroad were funded by the patient thrift of the people at home. It was a noble picture, the careful saving of the many gathered together and put to productive use by the wise few. But when he followed the figures, the picture inverted itself in his hands. The small savings were not the foundation. They were the bait. The institution did not need them in the way it claimed to need them because, as he had already discovered, it could create credit far beyond the sum of all the deposits it held. What it needed the small savings for was something else. It needed them to bind the ordinary people into the structure, to give them a stake in its survival, to make them believe that the giant's health was their own health. And it worked. The man who had placed his careful coins inside the institution would defend that institution. He would vote for governments that protected it. He would distrust anyone who attacked it. because an attack on the giant felt like an attack on his own small savings, on the years of going without, on the very idea that his thrift had meant something. The surgeon saw the cleverness of it and felt cold. The institution had not merely taken the toll from the gap between effort and payment, it had persuaded the very people it told to become its guardians. It had turned the man at the bottom of the chain into a soldier for the men at the top, simply by holding a small portion of his money and paying him a little interest on it, interest that was itself only a fraction of what his money earned for the men who truly held it. This was why, the surgeon understood, no panic ever truly destroyed the giant. When fear came and the holders of the great paper began to doubt, it was always the small savers who steadied the ship, because they had been taught for a generation that to doubt the institution was to doubt themselves. They held firm out of pride, out of habit, out of the deep human reluctance to believe that the thing one has trusted with one's whole modest fortune could be anything other than sound. The very people who had the most to lose and the least power to protect themselves were the ones whose faith kept the structure standing through every storm. The giant did not stand on gold, it stood on the loyalty of those it fed upon, a loyalty it had purchased cheaply and held securely, and the price of that loyalty was the willingness of millions never to look too closely at what they were defending. The surgeon wrote this down last of all, and when he had written it, he sat for a long time without moving. He had come into the room believing he was examining a machine for making money. He understood now that he had been examining a machine for making belief, and that the money was only the visible shadow of the belief, the part that could be counted. The true product, the thing the giant manufactured every single day in greater quantities than any mill-produced cloth, was the conviction in the minds of ordinary people that the arrangement above them was natural and fair and unchangeable, and theirs. That conviction was worth more than all the gold in the vault, because the gold could be spent and the gold could be lost. But the conviction renewed itself freely, generation after generation, taught in schoolrooms and repeated in newspapers and absorbed at the family table, until it felt less like an opinion and more like the shape of the world itself. He thought, then, of all the careful savers he had known in his own life. His own father had been one, a man who had gone without small comforts for 40 years so that there would be something put by, a man who had spoken of the institution that held his savings with a kind of reverence, as though it were a church. The surgeon thought of how his father would have received the report now sitting on the table in front of him. He thought of the disbelief, the hurt, the anger, not at the giant but at the son who dared to describe it. And he understood with a finality that settled the question of publication forever, that the truth he had found was not a gift the people would thank him for. It was a grief he would be inflicting on them, the grief of learning that the floor they had stood on all their lives was painted canvas stretched over a pit. Some men, he thought, are kinder for never being told. He was not sure he believed that. But he was no longer sure he disbelieved it either, and in that uncertainty the report found its grave. What are we to make of him, this last surgeon who cut open a living giant and then carried the wound in silence for the rest of his life? It would be easy to call him a coward. It would be easy to say that a braver man would have published and let the consequences fall where they might. But that judgment, I think, misses what he actually understood. He understood that the giant could not be killed by a report, because the giant did not live in any document. It lived in belief in the daily decisions of millions of people to trust the paper in their pockets and the stories in their newspapers and the men in the marble halls. You cannot stab a thing that lives in the minds of those it feeds upon. You can only change the minds slowly, one at a time, and that is not the work of a single report locked in a drawer. It is the work of generations. And so perhaps the surgeon's true message to us is not the contents of his report at all, though those contents matter. Perhaps his true message is the silence itself, and what the silence reveals. The most powerful structures in any age are not the ones defended by armies or by locks or by laws. They are the ones defended by the stories we tell ourselves about how the world works and why some men are rich and others are not. Those stories feel like simple common sense. They feel like the way things naturally are. And that feeling, that sense of naturalness, is the strongest wall ever built, because no one tries to climb a wall they cannot see. The surgeon saw the wall, he measured it, he wrote down its dimensions in careful ink. And then he understood that knowing the wall was there did not bring it down, and so he went quiet and he carried what he knew into the grave, and he left behind only a few hidden pages, and a question he never answered out loud. The question is the one he asked himself in the first week, bent over the books in the lamplight, and it is the one that still has no comfortable reply. If the men at the top did not grow it, or spin it, or weave it, or ship it, or sell it, then how exactly did they come to own so much more than the men who did all of those things? He found the answer, he wrote it down, and then he was told never to publish it. Tonight, more than a century later, in this small way, in this quiet retelling of what one careful man saw in a cold room in 1887, that answer is finally allowed to be heard. What you do with it is yours to decide. But now, at least, you have seen a little of what he saw. Now, at least, you know the giant was real, and that someone opened it, and that what beat inside it was never a heart of gold. It was a promise stretched thin, kept alive by the one thing the men in the marble